Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. It is an absolute honor to be here. Thank you. I particularly like talking at colleges and universities because I feel that there is a particular conversation not only among young people, but to have with young people if you're not a young person. You know, when I was your age, I wondered what it would be like to be like in my 50s or something. Whereas now, being older, I know exactly what it's like to be your age because I once was. I think the older you are, the more you know certain things, and the younger you are, the more you know other things. So there's a conversation that's significant. I think one of the ways in which those of us who are no longer young can be of service to those of you who are is the kind of archetypal role of the keeper of the story. So I'd like to go over with you some of the American story tonight, some of which we all know and which happened way before any of us got here, and some of which has to do with a particular historical era that I do remember, although you obviously do not. I want to start with what happened in 1776. In 1776, and we all know this, but sometimes history is something that you just know, but no longer imbibe anymore. It no longer pierces your heart. And they say, you know, if you don't know history, you don't learn from your history. But I think and that you sometimes make the same mistakes over and over again. But I think it's not just a matter of not making mistakes again. It's also a matter of doing some really wonderful things again that other generations did before us. In 1776, very brave men actually signed the Declaration of Independence. And with the signing of that declaration, they established America's mission statement. We all know this. The idea is that all men are created equal, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And then two very juicy points after that. Number one, that governments are instituted to secure those rights. And number two, that if the government's not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. Now, those were radical ideas. They were radical ideas in 1776, and they're radical today. And they were a complete repudiation of tyranny. They were the complete repudiation of the very idea that only a few people were entitled. Only a few people were entitled to land in the ancient aristocracies. Only a few people were entitled to education. Only a few people were entitled to the material means to make their dreams come true. Now, we all know that that's extraordinary. We all know that that is where it began. We all know that that was and is a bright light unto the world. It was and is an earth-shattering ideal. But we also know that 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, out of the 56, 41 of them were slave owners. So I start tonight by pointing this out, that that dichotomy is the American story. That bipolar nature of the American DNA, that's who we are. That's who we have always been. That's who we are today, both. That drama is carried out and played out in every generation, that we are both a nation founded on the most enlightened and aspirational principles that have ever formed the core of a nation, and we have always been in every generation, and in some ways are today, the most violent perpetrators of transgression against those principles. Now, when you see that, every generation, I believe, just like when you go to therapy, you learn about your family history, or you learn about the history of your particular tribe. It helps you know who and where you are when you know who and where those before you have been. It gives you a sense of power and understanding of your own identity when you have a clearer vision of it in relation to who came before, and it gives you a greater sense of what you're responsible for in terms of generations that will come after. It's also important that we realize our identities as Americans, that identity that we share, and see where we fit into a longer narrative. Now, as we've played out over time, the narrative of American history has been that over time, we do tend to self-correct. Now, every generation decides for itself what what chapter will rewrite in this continuing narrative? We did respond to slavery with abolition. We did respond to the oppression of women with two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement. And we did respond to institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South with the civil rights movement. Suppression of rights to gay people was responded to with the marriage equality movement, and even today, the cultural annihilation and genocide of Native Americans is in part being responded to by thousands of Americans who are taking a stand at Standing Rock and at the Bakken pipelines. We're a continuing story. We're a people in process. Every people are on a journey, just like every individual is as well. I think it's important that we remember, in order to see where we are and how we fit in, that in all of the cases that I mentioned above, the United States government did not decide to correct what was wrong. The United States government did not decide to abolish slavery. That's not how it happened. The abolitionist movement emerged from the people. The people rose up, and the people stepped in. Same with women's suffrage. The US government didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's give women the right to vote. Why not? That's not what happened. With the women's movement, the women's suffragette movement, the people woke up and the people stepped in. Same was true with civil rights. The US government did not wake up one day and decide to make sure that the South would desegregate. That's not what happened. With Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, the people woke up, the people rose up, and the people stepped in. Well, I've had a 35-year career working up close and personal with people going through periods of crisis. And all that a nation is a group of people. And the same psychological and emotional and spiritual forces that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation. And I know something about crisis, not just having worked with it so much professionally, but also having been a human being living on this planet. And I know that there are certain principles that apply. And that if these principles are applied, that crisis does transform into opportunity. And our country is in crisis. But our country will not transform, our country will not move from crisis into opportunity unless we do the things that I'm very clear need to be done in order for transformation to occur. And that's what you have to look at yourself in the mirror. And that's what you have to be brutally honest with yourself. And that means you have to admit your own character defects. That means you have to atone for your mistakes. That means you have to make amends where necessary and where possible. That means you have to take a good look at where you are who you say you are, where you aren't who you say you are, where you have to rise up, rise to the occasion, get yourself back on track, imagine the future that you want, stop whining, stop bitching, stop moaning, and get about the business of being the people or the nation that you say you are. Now, what has happened to us as a nation? What has happened is that in many ways we have reverted, we have regressed, because we are not a functioning, vital democracy. And I would think that everybody here is very clear about that. This really isn't a time when Americans need to wake up to what's true. This is a time when Americans need to own what's true and have the courage to act on what we all know is true. That's the time in which we're living. We have been sliding from a functioning democracy for the last 40 years. Now, I'm not going to whitewash American capitalism before 40 years ago and tell you guys, oh, it was so fabulous before 40 years ago. But I can tell you that it was better, and I'll tell you why it was better. Not because we were perfect, not because America always got it right, hardly. But before this awful slide began 40 years ago, there was a social consensus that we were supposed to try. And when America got it wrong, we knew enough to be ashamed of ourselves. We knew enough that, oh, that wasn't what was supposed to happen. Starting 40 years ago, with the advent of trickle-down economics, an amoral economic theory took hold of this country. It's not an immoral economic theory, it's an amoral economic theory. But an amoral economic theory inevitably has immoral consequences. Because this theory is not filled with people who wake up in the morning and try to figure out how to hurt children. It's not made of people who wake up in the morning and try to figure out how to hurt indigenous tribes somewhere. It's not filled with people who wake up in the morning and try to figure out how to hurt the planet. That's not what it is. But it's ultimately just as destructive, because it's filled with people who feel that they are justified in not thinking about those things one way or the other. And that theory, the idea that all that a corporation should have to worry about is its fiduciary responsibility to its own stockholders, even if that's at the expense of the worker, even if that's at the expense of the community, even if that's at the expense of the environment, became the organizing principle of American society. It corrupted our government. It exploded with a huge amount of corporate money that would so influence the government that the government, in essence, became its handmaiden. All of this took us to where we are now, where we are not a functioning government of the people and by the people and for the people. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was standing on the battlefield at Gettysburg when he said that those men who died, those thousands of men who died at the Battle of Gettysburg, had died so that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. It's perishing. It's perishing. We're not a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and we know that. We are a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, and for a few of the people. We are a government of huge multinational corporate interests, by huge multinational corporate interests, and for huge multinational corporate interests. We have reverted. We are not a functioning democracy. We are a functioning corporate aristocracy. We repudiated that stuff in 1776. It is time to repudiate it again. Now, as we've already discussed this evening, it's not like this is the first time that forces which represented the exact opposition and opposition to democracy were among us. It's just that we want to remember to identify with the generations before us who pushed back against those forces. We're not dealing with anything other generations in their time have not dealt with. We've already talked about the abolitionists, we've already talked about the suffragettes, and we've already talked about the civil rights movement. You and I aren't dealing with anything those people didn't deal with. We're not the first generation to have to deal with organized, institutionalized forces which would erode democracy and assault everything it's about. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. And that. You, this room, those of you who are students, none of you will live the majority of your lives in the 20th century. And some of you were not even born in the 20th century. You should not live a life at the effect of or burdened by bad economic ideas from the 20th century. I'm sure many of you, being in your 20s, let's say, are deeply involved in the process of your own individuation. You're looking deeply at the behavior of your parents, and you want to see, where did my parents get it right, and where did my parents get it wrong? Because where my parents got it right, I want to build on that. I want to stand on the shoulders of giants. I want to pass all that on to my own children someday. But there are probably some other things that your parents did, and you go, no, that chain needs to break right here. I'm not passing that on. That's how you have to look at this country. What did we do right? Stand on it, make it even better. And what this country has done wrong, you have the right. Stop that right here. And what you should not expect is for paternalistic political status quo to fix itself for you. That's not what the status quo does. Status quos live and survive by perpetuating themselves. We have been trained, and you are inheritors of that training, to ask pretty please about things that, excuse me, are supposed to be the rights of every American. Now, this trickle-down economic theory, I'm sure you all know this, was first introduced in the 80s because it was going to be great for everybody to see. All we had to do was increase stockholder value. And before the 80s, CEOs weren't even allowed. It wasn't even legal for a stockholder, for a CEO to be paid with stock options. As soon as that started in the 80s, then you had CEOs with an inherent conflict to help the worker was in conflict with their own monetary gain. The whole thing became so corrupt, and it just got worse from there. But most importantly, we want to remember what the promise was. The promise was that all that money would be made by these corporate aristocrats, but that would be great for everybody, see, because all that money would trickle down and it would lift all boats. It's been 40 years. I think once after 40 years, you can kind of see whether something worked. It so did not lift all boats. It has left millions of people without even a life vest. It has created the greatest income inequality since 1929. It has led us to a situation where 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. And of course, that system, in order to feed itself, looks at the likes of you. It looks at the smart ones, looks at the talented ones, cool ones, and it says, come on in, we need you to work the machinery. And then if you even start to complain, its message to you would be, what are you complaining about? You're doing fine. Of course, that's what fuels the system. You're not doing fine, or at least your kids won't be doing fine, if there is 90% of Americans out there who are living with chronic economic anxiety every single day. We have almost a third of Americans who do live with chronic economic anxiety every day. 93 million Americans live near poverty, 43 million in abject poverty. That means millions and millions of people who live every day, every single day, not really knowing what would happen if they got sick, not really knowing what would happen if their kids got sick, not really knowing what would happen, how are they going to send their kids to college, and living every single day, hundreds of thousands of people not knowing how they're ever going to get out from under the shackle of these college loans. All of this in the richest country in the world. And yet we have a government whose policies do more to advocate for the ability of those who already have a lot of money to make more money, and makes it more difficult for those who do not have money to even make it at all. But those are not just statistics. Those are not just dry facts. Those are human lives we're talking about. And what this has created is a huge sea of unnecessary human suffering. All of this is why I believe we need a massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the life of the average American. We need a massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the life of the average American in order to unleash the spirit of the American people. You see, money does not come from a bunch of corporate aristocrats living up on some Mount Olympus of American corporatism someplace, dropping crumbs from their table in the form of job creation. I mean, how paternalistic is that? This is what the average American should say to the corporate aristocrats. Give me health care, give me a good education, give me a fair shot, and I'll create my own damn career. Because money does not actually come from a bunch of crumbs falling down from the aristocrats' table. Money comes from the creativity and the productivity of the American people, and that means you. So anything that helps you thrive is what public policy is for. Anything that helps you thrive. That's why all of us should have free health care. That is why all of us should have free college tuition at state colleges and universities. That's why none of you should be shackled by college loans, because America will be better if you can spread your wings. America will be better if you can get about the business of living your dreams, of soaring, of manifesting everything that you want, of actualizing your own God-given potential. But the reason I'm here, the reason I'm talking to you, and the reason I'm running for president of the United States is that none of this is going to happen unless we, the people, make it happen. Incremental change will not change this. We need a fundamental pattern disruption of the political and social and economic patterns that rule America today. Donald Trump did not create all these problems. These problems created Donald Trump. Donald Trump is like an opportunistic infection. He could not have gotten hold of us had we not had a weakened societal immune system. And that means each and every one of us. The human body can take a lot of assault and injury as long as the immune system is working. The human psyche can take a lot of assault and injury as well because of a kind of psychic immune system. And democracy can take a lot of hit and a lot of injury as long as the immune system is working. Some major organs are very, very stressed in our democracy today. Intelligence agencies, pillars of our democracy, are trying to hold, and they're stressed. But we need a boost of our immune system, and that means an awakening among the American people. Donald Trump has ushered into the United States an era of political theater, and we will not be going back. He is not just a politician. He's a phenomenon, and the only way to override that is with a phenomenon of our own. That's not an individual, not at all. It's an awakening among the American people who hearken back to the spirit of 1776 and hearken back to the spirit of the abolitionists and hearken back to the spirit of the women's suffragettes and hearken back to the spirit of the civil rights workers who stood in the face of evil and knew when it was not enough to say, oh, I don't agree with that, who knew that it was not enough to just do a petition online even though there was no online, who knew that you couldn't have a social revolution over white wine and brie, who had the courage, who had the grit, who had the fierceness to say to certain things, stop right there. No, it's more than that. I don't agree with that. It's not on my watch. In other words, we need to rise up and say, in the most elegant, stylish way possible, hell no. Now, if you choose to elect me president, let me tell you what I will do. First of all, and some of these things I think are obvious to everyone, we need to repeal that 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the richest Americans. They won't feel it. That's number one. We need to repeal that tax cut. We need to put back in the middle class tax cut. Next, we have to stop these hideous and insidious corporate subsidies. We gave $26 billion alone last year to oil and gas. Martin Luther King used to say, if they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. If they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. The next thing we need to do is for the United States government to demand that it can negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies to lower drug prices. And the next thing, and we will talk more about this a little bit later, we need to say to the U.S. military, every dollar that you need, you get. But you need those hundreds of billions of dollars on top of what the military says it needs that just goes for short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. That stops now. In addition to that, we need to say to billionaires, we're happy for you. If you made your money righteously, good on you. But 3%, we'd like 3% on those assets, on those tax on your assets, please. Number one, like I said, they won't even feel it. Number two, we really want to keep in mind there's some very, very wealthy people in this country who agree with that, including billionaires who agree with that. And for people who have 50 million and more, 2% tax on those assets. Let's remember, not every wealthy person in America is a greedy bastard. And there are many, many people in America who have that kind of money who agree with everything that we're saying here. What is unsustainable for any of us at this point is ultimately unsustainable for all of us. Now, you do that. You do all the things that I mentioned, including that 3% tax on the assets of billionaires and 2% tax on the assets of 50 million and more. And guess what? We're going to have some cash on hand. And let me tell you, if I'm president, what we're going to do with all that cash. First of all, we're going to do that massive infusion of economic hope into the life of the average American in the form of Medicare for all, in the form of free college tuition, in the form of at state universities and colleges, and in the form of the cancellation of the college loan. And then we are going to go about a season of repair. And this is where it gets really serious. This country is in such disrepair that it's going to take a long time to get us back on track. And this is where I'm talking to you honestly in a way that I do not believe the political establishment tends to do. We have a politics of people-pleasing in this country. If you go to the doctor, you expect the doctor to tell you the truth. Because if the doctor doesn't tell you the truth, how are you going to have an honest, intelligent conversation about what to do about what might be wrong? If the test came back and it's cancer, the doctor has to be honest with you. And then what I've seen up close and personal with thousands of people's lives over my career is that it's when people get the bad news that we actually become our most intelligent. And so the doctor gives you bad news if it's bad news, and you listen to the doctor, and together you decide what are you going to do about it. But we have a politics where politicians don't necessarily tell you what's deeply wrong. They don't want to tell you what's deeply wrong because their operatives say, oh, that sounds negative and people won't want to vote for you. And also they don't want to tell you what's deeply wrong because if they told you what was deeply wrong, you might figure out how much they had to do with it. And so we have a politics that infantilizes people. It's a politics where the citizen is just a spectator. A citizen is just a poker chip. How many do you have? How many do you have? I'm not interested in that. I'm giving the same message whether you're rich or poor, whether you're black, white, or brown, whether you're gay or straight. We don't have time for any of that nonsense. We have to have a conversation about our country. We have to have a conversation as Americans. We have to have an honest, real conversation about what's really going on and what we need to do about it. You see, I'm not running against any other candidate. I'm running with a lot of really good, smart, wonderful people. And I'm not saying that any of them are lying, because all of them are telling you the truth. But this is the deal. If you go into a court of law and you raise your hand, you swear, not just to tell the truth. You swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm doing more than telling you the truth. We got to talk about the whole truth and nothing but the truth. We need some radical truth-telling in this country. And when we do some radical truth-telling, some of what we see is not fun. When we do some radical truth-telling, some of what we see will cause us pain. And you know what? Sometimes pain is what you should feel in life. Sometimes horror means you're healthy. Sometimes the fact that you're upset is a sign of mental health. The fact that we are so desensitized, the average American is so desensitized to the pain of so many millions of people, does not mean we're a healthy society. So you and I, as adults, have to look at some things. We need a season of moral repair. It's an amazing thing what happens in life. When you seek to do the right thing, you seek to have compassion, you seek to have integrity, you seek to stand up and be straight and have a spine and do right by people. What happens is that your life tends to work. And in those places where sometimes we're not those things, because none of us are perfect, and life goes awry, if we go back to those places, then life begins to improve itself and repair. And that's what the United States needs to do right now. We need a season of moral repair. We have millions of American children who live in chronic trauma. We have 13 million hungry children in the richest country in the world. We have 100,000 homeless children in America. We have children who are traumatized before preschool. We have hungry children who show up at elementary school and ask the teacher if maybe you have some food for me. We have elementary school children on suicide watch. We have children in the United States who go to school in classrooms where the circumstances and school supplies are not adequate to teach an 8-year-old child to read. If a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. A report recently said that 40% of the girls in the public school system in Chicago suffer from a form of PTSD, like millions of other children in America, many of whom live in America's domestic war zones. And yes, Washington, D.C. is no different than any other city in America. And these children live in neighborhoods where the violence is so great that their PTSD is not just post-traumatic trauma, it is present traumatic trauma because it is triggered and re-triggered every single day. This is a huge humanitarian emergency. We should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster. But it gets worse. The problem is not just that they exist. The problem is not just that they've been squeezed out because a virulent strain of capitalism has so gotten hold of our capitalist system, so gotten hold of our government, that they, who basically are of no use to that system, their needs just get shunted to the side. Forget all that stuff about everyone has the right to pursue happiness. What's even worse is that our government has simply normalized their despair. Why is that? We all know why. Because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. And they're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. And because they have no financial leverage, they can't possibly compete with the cloud of all the corporate forces whose money dominates Washington. Notice how politicians, even Democratic politicians, so often talk about the middle class. What about all the millions of people in the United States who wish they could call themselves middle class? What about all the people who are too poor to even be able to call themselves middle class? Well, they don't vote, so why do we even have to talk about it? That's how corrupt our system has become. We need what Martin Luther King called a coalition of conscience. You see, I have faith in the American people. If running for president has shown me anything, it's this. The system is even more corrupt than I thought, and the American people are even more wonderful than I knew. I don't talk to people like you're stupid because I don't think the American people are stupid. I don't talk to you like you're dumb or you're in high school and that's as far as you can go. What my experience of life and of my career has shown me is that no socioeconomic group has a monopoly on either morals or intelligence. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you're a greedy bastard, and just because you're poor doesn't mean you're not intelligent. I think we need to talk to the American people honestly. I think we need to talk to the American people in the place where you're not just coming from self-interest, but where you're coming from conscience, you're coming from deep intelligence, and you're coming from a concern for something that's higher than just yourself. We have to rescue these children. And that is why I want a United States Department of Children and Youth. Right now we have an education department. Right now we have within Health and Human Services certain agencies to help families and children. But the problem is so huge that these agencies are basically overwhelmed in terms of the adequate response to what is happening. Next time our congressmen and our senators take one of these jaunts over to the Middle East or someplace, not that those jaunts are important. I think they should take a jaunt over to the inner city of Chicago. I think they should take a jaunt over to the inner city of Indianapolis. I think they should take a jaunt over to the inner city of Washington, D.C. What we need is a government that does not just think about its donors and does not just think about the people it assumes is going to vote for them, but a government that truly is of all the people. We need trauma-informed education for these children. We need community wraparound services. We need nutrition. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. We need nutrition. We need mindfulness in the schools. And I'll tell you something else. It is immoral. It is wrong. And in the richest country in the world, it is a passive form of oppression to withhold from any child in any neighborhood a high-quality education for no other reason than that that child didn't win the birth lottery when it comes to financial advantage. What is this? What is this? We need to no longer base our education funding on property taxes. And if you want to talk about economic prosperity, I'll tell you how we can have economic prosperity in 10 years. Treat your children, your 10-year-olds, better today. If you want to see the entrepreneurial genius of this country, if you want to see the fuel for the most amazing 21st century, I'll tell you where it is. It's in the brain of every kindergartner in every neighborhood in America. And if I'm president of the United States, what I want is for every school in the United States to be a palace of learning, a palace of culture, and a palace of the arts. Next thing I want to talk to you about is our climate emergency. This is another area where we shouldn't kid ourselves. Incremental change is not going to be enough. We need a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change. We have 12 years to make a serious transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy. If we do not do this, we could face within 20 years a level of massive social collapse, the likes of which we have not seen in the modern era. We could be facing, you could be facing, whole swaths of countries where the heat has made the land uninhabitable. Whole swaths of countries and possibly whole swaths of continents. If the heat has made the land uninhabitable, that also means food cannot be grown there. If food cannot be grown there and the land is uninhabitable, we could have up to hundreds of millions of climate refugees. We also already have 63 displaced persons on this planet. We already have a refugee crisis. It's almost unimaginable to think of the food shortages, the refugee crisis, and the economic collapse that could occur if we do not take radical action now. We need to take radical action, but it cannot be in opposition to the industries that have brought large-scale industrial harm. And let's be honest with ourselves. We couldn't have fought World War II. We certainly could not have won World War II without fossil fuels. I mean, there was a time when their use was legitimate. But for those of you who are too young to remember, I want you to know that when Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, one of the first things he did was he put solar panels on the roof of the White House. If we had listened to him in the 1970s when he said we need to start going green, we would not be where we are today. The first thing Ronald Reagan did when he was elected in 1980 was to remove the solar panels from the roof of the White House. We are where we are now. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we used to talk about the Paris Climate Accords. Heck, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords is like the kindergarten move. Of course we need to. And we're now at a point where I don't think just the Green New Deal is enough either. And so I want to say something to those of you who are college age. We have so much that we have to do. We have so much that we have to repair. We have a big ship that we need to turn around. And it will not turn around just in the space of one 4-year or one 8-year administration of any president. If I'm president of the United States, we will have a referendum. It will not be legislation that I submit to Congress. It will be up to you. This referendum is to be voted on only by Americans between the ages of 18 and 26. I want a referendum where those of you between 18 and 26 will weigh in. Would you be okay with 1 year mandatory national service between 18 and 26? Quite simply, we need you. What that would mean is if you want to be a doctor or a nurse, you could help us in one of these rural hospitals that are closing. If you want to be a teacher, we could use you in one of these underserved schools. If you want to be an architect, we could use you in some of this environmental infrastructure repair. On one hand, when you look at the Green New Deal, so many jobs will be created. But if we're honest with ourselves, the level of social and material repair that we need in this country is so great that it will at the very least be worth the conversation among you. It will be a referendum, you decide. If the referendum is turned down, that's the end of the story for me. But I think it's a conversation of great use and great meaning, where we face honestly what is happening in this country and what is going to be necessary to really get this country back on track. We need a situation where those large industries that have done industrial level repair harm to this planet are now enrolled in the process of industrial scale repair. And I feel that I'm good for that job because I'm not perceived as anti-capitalist because I'm not an anti-capitalist. The free market has been good to me. The problem in America is not that some people can get rich here. That's a good thing that people can get rich in America. The problem is that not enough people can get rich in America today. And so the issue is not, to me, capitalism is a problem, but this virulent strain of capitalism that has caused immeasurable damage. It is an amoral system, and it has caused immoral effects that absolutely must be addressed in the most radical way and quickly in order for us to end an aberrational chapter of American history and begin a new one. The third thing I want to talk to you about is race in America. The United States, as I said, we can have the most amazing century. You can have the most amazing century, but we got to clean some things up. A lot of the things that could go wrong if this whole thing blows, I probably wouldn't even live to see, but it would be right about the time of your full blossoming. If we want you, if we want this country to have the century that is possible, then there's some things that we're going to have to clean up. And no individual and no country can have the future that we want if we're not willing to clean up the past. Catholics go to confession. Jews, the holiest day of the year in Judaism is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In Alcoholics Anonymous, people have to take a fearless moral inventory and address the exact nature of their character defects. Racism is America's original character defect. But the point of atonement and the point of making amends is that you can end a chapter and start again. It is not my experience and it's not my belief that the average American is a racist. I don't believe that the average American is a racist, but I do believe that the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. And when I'm in some of the whitest states in the Union, when I'm in New Hampshire, when I'm in Iowa, what I find is people who are open, people who hear we are a decent people, we are a good people. I feel that now more than I've ever felt it in my life. We are a good and a decent people. I'm not saying we're better than other people, because I don't think we're better than other people, but we're a good people. And when people hear it spelled out, things which to every black person is like, yeah, we know that, but too many white people either never heard it or they heard it in the 7th grade and they haven't been thinking about it. So let's just go over the facts just a little. The first slave ships were brought here in 1619. Slavery did not end until 1865. That's 250 years. Abject slavery. At the end of that, there were 12 years where the federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reconstituted. And actually, during those 12 years, some amazing things happened. Black congresspeople, black senators, et cetera. But many people just held their breath until those federal troops left. And this is also something that would have been a very different history had Abraham Lincoln lived. Once the federal troops left throughout the South, legislatures passed what were called the Black Code Laws. Black Code Laws were to ensure subpar economic, social, and political opportunity for black people. That lasted until 100 years after the end of the Civil War, 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So let's go back. Because the 20th century was dominated by a mindset, very mechanistic. You want to change things, you just tweak the pieces of the machine. That's not the 21st century. The 21st century is much more whole person, it's much more integrative, it's much more holistic. So I'm asking you to think about these things with your heart. Think about these things with all of you. These are not just historical facts. You've got 250 years of slavery, followed by, okay, slaves are emancipated. You're told you were an enslaved person yesterday. You're not an enslaved person now. Where are you supposed to go? What are you supposed to do? That's why Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, promised 40 acres and a mule to every former enslaved family of 4. Once the troops left, that promise was rescinded. That was followed by another 100 years. Except for those 12 years of Reconstruction, we're talking about 100 years of domestic terror and institutionalized violence against black people. What do you call lynchings, if not domestic terror? What do you call Ku Klux Klan, if not domestic terror? You're talking about 350 years of institutionalized violence against black people. I think we'd all agree that if you've been kicking people to the ground, you have a moral responsibility to do 2 things. Number 1, stop kicking. Number 2, to say, here, let me help you get back up. The economic gap that existed at the end of the Civil War has never been closed. Many efforts on the part of black communities to accumulate wealth have been thwarted by state and local laws and activities. And in some ways, we all know we're sliding backwards. 1964, the Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act gave equal access to the polls to every American. The problem is, since 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court has been chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts all over the country. Plus, we're sliding back with things like mass incarceration, racial disparity in criminal sentencing, mandatory minimums, and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, it is time to pay reparations for slavery. Germany has paid, since World War II, has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. And I remind you also that reparations will be an economic stimulus. My plan, and reparations is very different than race-based policies. Race-based policies, let's have a study, let's get more evidence. We don't need more evidence. By the way, let's all remember with love John Conyers, who passed from this realm today. John Conyers was the one who brought forth H.R. 40, which would have established a commission to study reparations. Now, the issue is, race-based policies say, and they're good, I mean, race-based policies say anti-discrimination, race-based policies, anti-discrimination laws, billions of dollars on historically black colleges, billions of dollars, for instance, on capital for black businesses, home ownership, et cetera. All that's good, but it carries no moral force. It carries no spiritual value. Why is that? Because it's the same continuation of the same paternal lineage. I hurt you, I mess with you, now let me tell you how I'm gonna fix you. The other thing about race-based policies is not good enough to me, is it leaves open the question, whose fault is this? Reparations go further. They carry moral force, they carry emotional and psychological influence, because reparations contain an inherent mea culpa, an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that was done, an inherent acknowledgement of a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of a people to pay it. What we do and have been doing ever since the end of the Civil War is taking this baton of racial turbulence, racial turmoil, and we just pass it down generation to generation. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to minimize, nor would I, the struggles or the sacrifices of any of our ancestors, black or white, but it is time for us to take the next big step. See, this is the thing. Americans are hardwired for great things. You're an American. We were born of a big thing. We don't do little things well. We're like a big airplane. You see a big jet in the sky, and it's like this amazing, awesome thing. You see it just on the runway, and it's just a clunky piece of metal. Or you see a race car, and a race car is on the open road. It's like amazing. But if it's just on a residential street, it's kind of like, what is that? Americans are not weary. We're not tired because we're doing too much. Americans are weary and tired because we're not doing enough. We are hardwired for big things. We are hardwired for great things, not just a little plan here, a little policy there, let's change a little there or here. No, 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 no. We are hardwired for great things. We want to end one aberrational chapter. That is why I believe it's time, not only for reparations for slavery, but also for some serious fundamental reparative measures to Native Americans in the United States. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is the proverbial military-industrial complex. Stunning to me that only two of us are even talking about this on this campaign. That's how trained we've all been. We're not even to talk about things that they don't sanction as the issues they want us to discuss. So this is the deal. Once again, most of us know this, but let's go over the history a little. Dwight Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, headed all Allied forces during World War II. Before World War II, we had no standing army. Obviously, we had to have one at the end of the war, and obviously we need one today. But Dwight Eisenhower, after World War II, which ended in 1945, 1952 to 1960, he was an American Republican president. He was followed by John F. Kennedy. And right before John F. Kennedy was inaugurated, Eisenhower made his farewell address. In his farewell address, he coined the phrase, warning the American people of the military-industrial complex. If anybody knew about the need for the military, Dwight Eisenhower did. But he also knew the dangers that lay ahead if we were not ever vigilant about how much money there is to be made. Let's own what we know. This is not stuff that we don't know. We don't have universal health care because the health insurance companies and big pharma has stood in the way. We don't have reasonable gun safety laws because gun manufacturers have stood in the way. We have not repaired our earth. We have continued to hurt our earth because oil and gas and fossil fuel companies have stood in the way of responsible action. We don't have the healthy food we need. We have contaminants in our water. We have carcinogens in our food. And we have toxins in our air. Why? Because of the short-term profit maximization for chemical companies and food companies. We have turned the FDA and the CDC as whores and handmaidens to big pharma, and we have turned the FAA as whores and handmaidens to Boeing and so forth, although I think that might be changing now as we speak after the Boeing MAX disasters. And we do not have plans to proactively wage peace, but rather our national security agenda is dominated by an incessant and perpetual war machine because of short-term profit manufacturers for defense contractors. Ladies and gentlemen and everyone else, if there's any place where the people need to step in, it's this one. We spend $760 billion a year on our defense budget. We spend $40 billion on our State Department budget. Within our State Department budget, $17 billion is spent on the USAID, which is long-term development and assistance, humanitarian assistance. In addition to that, within the $40 billion, there is less than $1 billion spent on peace building. We are long past thinking that you don't have to take care of your body, and then if you get sick, you just take medicine. You can't just take medicine. You have to proactively cultivate your health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And similarly, war is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. We're not going to just back ourselves up into peace. You're in a generation where nobody even imagines anymore the idea of peace. I heard Dennis Kucinich once say, we must challenge the idea that war is inevitable. Nobody even imagines it anymore. When I was your age, at least we talked about banning the bomb. We have all been just trained to just accept that there's always going to be a war, there's always going to be a war, there's always going to be a war. This is dangerous. And so what we need to realize is that just as you have to cultivate health, not just fight disease, we have to cultivate peace, not just be prepared for war. I have a lot of respect for the U.S. military. My father fought in World War II, and I believe that the military should get every dollar that they say they need, as I said. But we should see the military like a surgeon. Does the United States need a good surgeon on hand just in case we need surgery? Of course. Of course we should, and of course we do. And we should all, by the way, give a lot of kudos in our hearts today to the very brave military which carried out the action, which got al-Baghdadi in the last 24 hours. But at the same time, you can't just prepare for war, you have to cultivate peace. That's why if you make me president, we're going to have a United States Department of Peace, because we need to give the peace-building agencies equal weight on the national security agenda as we do the military. There are 4 factors which, when present, statistically indicate that there will be a higher level of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. Expanded economic opportunities for women, expanded educational opportunities for children, reduction of violence against women, and amelioration of unnecessary human suffering. Why is that? Because desperate people do desperate things. What do you think these people crossing a desert from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador are, except escaping violent, desperate situations, that they are willing to do something like that? Desperate people do desperate things, and desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. And that is why all domestic policy, both domestic and international, should be built around one core principle. And if I'm president, they will be. And that core principle will be, what would help people thrive? But you see, a bottom line of increasing short-term corporate profits is the opposite of a bottom line, what would help people thrive. We have to shift paradigm completely from an economic bottom line to a humanitarian bottom line. And when we shift from an economic bottom line to a humanitarian bottom line, our economy will be better off and the state of our humanity will be better off. Even more than that, you'll have a chance for peace in your lifetime and in the lifetime of your children. Don't kid yourselves. Right now, the United States, for the sake of $360 billion arms sale to that murderous crown prince in Saudi Arabia, we are giving aerial support to a genocidal war that man is waging against the people of Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have starved, including children. When our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was asked, how can we do that? We're the United States. We're supposed to be the good guys. His response was that sometimes you have strategic partnerships with people who don't share your values. Well, I'm here to tell you, no, you don't, and no, you can't. That means you have no values. And I had the honor of meeting the Dalai Lama several years ago, and he said to me that the people of the world no longer see the United States as champions of democracy, champions of humanitarian values. All of this has happened. All of this is a product of bad public policy, and it can be changed by good public policy. But none of the public policy changes that I've talked to you about tonight are incremental changes, just going far enough to help people on the periphery, but not far enough to challenge the underlying forces that make all that suffering inevitable. And just in case is not quite clear enough, I want to make sure you know about the B-21 Raiders. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider each cost $560 million. But this is the deal about these bombers. They drop conventional bombs that we would expect. But they don't just drop conventional bombs. They also drop nuclear bombs. Maybe I'm stupid being a girl and all, but I just don't understand. I don't understand why we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs. Can anybody tell me? You drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it, because every nuclear bomb that exists on the planet today makes Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like a pinprick. You drop 10 of those, it's over for the human race on this planet. Do you think that 100 B-21 Raiders at $560 billion has anything to do with the legitimate security needs of the United States? At what point are the American people going to say, enough is enough? See, it's not just about enough is enough to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the re-election of Donald Trump, I admit, is going over the cliff, and we must make sure that that does not happen. But we need to do more than not go over the cliff. We have to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. If we simply don't go over the cliff, those same forces will be back hard-hitting in 22 and midterms and hard-hitting in 24. You know, I read a book called The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd, and that book is about 2 women who actually lived. They were historical figures born in Charleston, South Carolina, to a slave-owning family. And they became, in time, leading abolitionists and 2 leading original feminists. They went through an experience that many people in those days did, born into slave-owning families and ultimately realizing where they were. It took a lot to break free of that. You would be completely ostracized by your family, completely ostracized by your community. They were converted by the Quakers. And this is what that book made me think about: the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. You see, being anti-slavery meant you didn't agree with slavery, but you're not agreeing with slavery, you're not having a slave, you're not participating, you're not living in a slave-owning state, did not of itself move the needle for one slave. But some people crossed the bridge. It was a psychological bridge, it was a moral bridge, it was an emotional bridge, it was a bridge within themselves from I don't agree with it to not on my watch. That is what is needed now. I know that no one here agrees with millions of traumatized children, undereducated. I know no one in this room agrees with a ridiculous national security agenda based more on short-term profit maximization for defense contractors and the nuclear industry than on helping people and on building peace. We have more lovers than haters in this country, obviously. But those who hate, the bigots and the anti-Semites and the racists and the homophobes, they're active today. They're convicted today. They're politicized today. And conviction is a force multiplier. There are way more people who love than hate, but those of us who love must become as convicted behind our love as some people have made it clear that they are convicted behind their hate. I read an interview in Rolling Stone magazine with Jared Kushner. I think it was Rolling Stone. And Jared Kushner said in this interview that 2 years before the last presidential election, he said to his father-in-law, there are a lot of angry people out there. We could harness all that anger and make you president. You know what I thought? What I thought to myself is what I want you to know right now. The way I look at it, I see a lot of good people out there. And if we harness all that, we can change the world. It's time. And to those of you who are young, I know that this is not a convenient time to have a crisis. No crisis in life is convenient. Pearl Harbor was not convenient. This is not convenient. But I'll tell you one of the things I've learned about crisis. I've learned it in my own life, and I've seen it in so many other people's lives, being up close and personal. I had friends whose house was destroyed in an earthquake in California. Fortunately, they weren't home, they weren't in town. And when I said to the woman afterwards, I said, I'm so sorry about your house. She said, actually, you know, there's some good things about this. There were some things about that house we didn't like, actually, and when we rebuild it, it's going to be better. So sometimes, you know, they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, every problem comes bearing its own solution. This crisis is going to serve all of you well. because there were some rotten, rotten things in the core of this house, and it was time. We have two choices. We can learn now or we can learn later. We can learn through wisdom or we will learn through pain. What we have to do is rise up. And when you do rise up, you're going to find actually aspects of yourself, who you are, what you're made of, what it means to be an American. This country is going to be better. It's going to be better for you if we rise to the occasion now. But don't let them put you to sleep. And don't let them put you to sleep because you go to George Washington University and you're one of the lucky ones and you're one of the privileged ones. Don't let them do that to you. Some of you might be thinking, well, I'm not privileged. I don't have money. It doesn't matter if you don't have money. The very fact you're in school here means you're among the privileged ones. And that's the game. Don't let them do it to you. Remember, if it's wrong, you got to stand up. If it's wrong, you say politely, hell no. So, I'm not here to elevate the conversation. We need to elevate this country. We don't have a lot of time to just talk about this. We don't have time to stand on the periphery. This is our crisis and this is our time. This is the era of data collection is over. I didn't say anything tonight that everybody here doesn't already know. You might not have known all the details, but basically everything I said to you, you already know. This isn't the time to wake up to things we didn't already know. This is a time emotionally and psychologically to own what we know, to rise to the occasion with what we know. Quite simply, let's kick ass. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.